I want to go on to something else we talked about last night. In fact, we've talked about on this show for years, and I've written about it for more than a decade, and that is that the debate about nuclear energy for Australia is unavoidable. The case is clear-cut, and thankfully the coalition under Peter Dutton are going to outline a clear plan to inject nuclear into our energy mix.
We do need to look at the best technology, zero emissions. I think it's the only credible pathway we have to our international commitments to net zero by 2050. And I think there's a huge problem that the government's got that they're just not willing to address.
Now, mark my words, this won't be an easy debate for the coalition. There will be plenty of fear-mongering and misinformation from Labor, but the facts all favour the nuclear energy argument. Let's go to coalition spokesman on climate and energy, Ted O'Brien. Ted, thanks for joining us. We all have to await more detail, but there have been suggestions today that you might outline in your policy 5 or 6 potential sites for nuclear reactors in Australia. This will be a welcome act of clarity because so often we hear the refrain of who wants the reactor in their backyard.
Great to be with you again, Chris, and our position from the get-go has been to be open and transparent, which is why when we release our policy, we want to be as open as we possibly can be, including addressing those challenges around locations. I think it is only fair and reasonable that the Australian people ask such questions, and as we take this agenda forward, we will continue to be very open about it. We've talked recently about the need for us to be looking at a coal to nuclear strategy, and in taking an all of the above approach, we need to ensure that zero emissions nuclear energy forms part of a balanced mix of technologies for a future grid. And so as we do see coal plants eventually retire from the grid, there's an ideal opportunity for zero emissions plants, the new stuff, the new and emerging technology. No one wants the stuff from the 1950s, the Soviet era technologies, but looking at small modular reactors, large reactors and the like, to say, well, okay, what role can they play in a balanced mix moving forward?
Yeah, obviously renewable energy will be part of the mix, as will perhaps a little bit of gas way into the future. But nuclear just offers that reliable, sustainable, zero emissions technology. Now, the obvious locations are places like in the Hunter Valley of New South Wales, the Latrobe Valley of Victoria, and in the Iron Triangle of South Australia, where there have been large coal-fired power stations either shut down or about to shut down, and they're surrounded by industrial wastelands, if you like, and importantly, they're linked into existing transmission networks, so we don't have to have an extra 10,000 kilometres of transmission lines crisscrossing the country.
And Chris, I'll allow you to muse about specific locations. I won't at this point, but to agree with your principal point there, which is the importance of leveraging existing infrastructure. And I learnt this when I was travelling internationally, seeing best practice and how the rest of the world is dealing with this. There's actually a very good report for the Department of Energy in the United States that talks about reducing capital costs for nuclear plants by over 30% if you can leverage that existing infrastructure. These are all the sorts of things that go into a technical assessment that drive some of the policy. And ultimately, it's technical assessment, socio-economic assessments and a social licence. All of these things are key when it ultimately comes to Australians deciding on the question of where for nuclear.
You're going to hear all the old arguments. Labor's already started to trot them out. They say that, what are you going to do about the waste? They raise the safety issues and they raise the cost issue. Now, the point is, though, in Japan, in France, in the UK, in the US, in South Korea, in Finland, go on and on and on, there are modern, successful economies that are dealing with this stuff. And also, the left of politics in most of those countries have accepted it. In other words, all those factual arguments have already been lost overseas. So that's going to strengthen your arm in Australia.
I think you're right, Chris, and I think the more that people look at what the rest of the world is doing, the more they realise that Anthony Albanese, Chris Bowen, they cut very lonely figures in the world today because even the far left of some political systems, liberal democracies, are cheering on nuclear energy. You know, the United States is often spoken about as being hyper-partisan, where you've got the Democrats and you've got the Republicans and they're disagreeing on everything. Well, I tell you what they agree on, the need for nuclear energy in the mix. That's not going to change as we move forward. And John Kerry, the climate envoy for the United States, makes it crystal clear, without nuclear you can't get to net zero. Absolutely,
that is a fact. There's a scientific fact. Now, just before I let you go, Ted, I want to segue to state politics in your home state of Queensland, and Stephen Miles misleading state parliament so clearly. Can he stay on as Premier?
Oh, look, with the Labor Party, if you could promote him beyond Premier, they would. This is what they do. I'm sorry to say it, Chris, but lying is a part of their business model in the Labor Party. They just have to stop telling lies. The thing that annoyed me about Premier Miles was he ended up having to own up in Parliament. But it wasn't because suddenly his conscience told him that he should do the right thing. It was because he was busted.
Exactly. Exactly.
And he made that crystal clear. Like, I mean, seriously.
Yeah, I'm sorry because I've been
busted,
caught out.
I better own up. That's it.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Unbelievable stuff. Thanks for joining us, Ted. I appreciate it. Ted O'Brien, who's the Shadow Climate Change and Energy Minister for the Federal Coalition.